Right now, you think you just decided to keep reading this sentence. You feel like you chose it, like there was a moment, a tiny flicker of you that looked at two options and picked one. But the real answer is far stranger. By the time you felt like you were choosing, your brain had already chosen for you, half a second earlier, maybe more. The feeling of choosing came after the choice was made, not before it. Let that sit for a second. Every decision you've ever felt proud of, every decision you've ever regretted. What if you weren't actually in the room when they happened? In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet ran an experiment that should have ended the conversation about free will forever. He didn't set out to destroy anyone's sense of self. He just wanted to measure timing. Libet hooked people up to EEG machines, sensors that read electrical activity in the brain. He asked them to do something simple. Flex a finger whenever they felt like it. No pressure, no pattern, just whenever the urge struck. Then he asked them to watch a fast-moving clock and mark the exact moment they felt the conscious urge to move. Here's where it gets strange. Libet's machines picked up a buildup of brain activity called the readiness potential. Think of it as your brain quietly revving its engine before a decision. And that revving started about 300 to 500 milliseconds before people reported feeling the urge to move. Your brain was already building the decision, and you, the conscious, feeling part of your mind, hadn't shown up to the meeting yet. So who made the choice? For decades, scientists argued about what this really meant. Maybe it was just noise. Maybe Libet's clock-watching method was too clumsy to trust. Fair criticisms. Science should be skeptical of itself. Then, in 2008, a neuroscientist named John Dylan Haynes decided to push the question further. He used fMRI scanners, which track blood flow in the brain, to map activity in far more detail than EEG ever could. Haynes asked people to press a button with either their left or right hand whenever they wanted, while deciding freely which hand to use. His team found something that still unsettles people today. Patterns in the brain's frontal and parietal regions, areas involved in planning and intention, predicted which hand a person would choose up to 7 to 10 seconds before they were consciously aware of deciding. 7 to 10 seconds. That's an eternity in brain time. Your decision wasn't made in some sudden flash of willpower. It was already forming quietly, in the background, while your conscious mind was still catching up, still waiting to feel like it was in charge. Imagine a general who shows up to a battlefield 10 minutes after the battle's already been won, and then writes the official report claiming full credit for the victory. That's not far from what's happening inside your skull. But here's the twist that makes this even harder to sit with. Your brain doesn't just make decisions without you. It also builds a convincing story afterward, explaining why you decided. Psychologists call this confabulation, when the brain invents a reasonable-sounding explanation for something it didn't actually witness happening. A researcher named Daniel Wegner spent much of his career studying exactly this. He called it the illusion of conscious will. Not because your intentions don't exist. They do. But because the feeling of causing an action might be something your brain generates after the fact, almost like a press release, rather than something that genuinely steers behavior in the moment. Wegner pointed to split brain patients, people whose left and right brain hemispheres had been surgically separated for medical reasons, as some of the clearest evidence. In certain experiments, one hemisphere would trigger an action, like moving a hand, while the other hemisphere, the one responsible for language, had no direct access to why it happened. And what did that language hemisphere do? It made something up, instantly, confidently. The patient would offer a perfectly reasonable-sounding explanation for an action their conscious mind never actually chose. If your brain can invent reasons for things it didn't decide, how would you ever know the difference between a real reason and a convincing story? This is where the philosophy gets uncomfortable. If your choices are built before you're aware of them, and your sense of choosing is partly a story stitched together afterward, what exactly is free will describing? Is it a real force steering your behavior? Or is it more like a narrator who arrives after the movie's already been filmed, confidently describing scenes they never directed? Philosophers have wrestled with versions of this question for centuries, long before EEG machines existed. Ancient Stoic thinkers argued that much of what feels like choice is actually the unfolding of forces already set in motion by nature, by circumstance, by your own prior character. They didn't have brain scans, but they noticed the same gap between feeling in control and actually being in control. Modern neuroscience just gave that old intuition a timestamp. So does this mean nothing you do matters? That you're a puppet? And the strings are just neurons firing in patterns you'll never see coming? Not exactly. And this is the part most people miss. Even if the readiness potential builds before conscious awareness, that buildup is still happening inside your brain. Your memories, your values, your past experiences, the conversation you had last week that quietly shifted how you think. All of that shapes the unconscious process that becomes your decision. The you that exists before conscious awareness kicks in isn't some separate alien force controlling you from outside. It's still you. Just a version of you operating faster and deeper than your awareness can keep up with. Maybe free will was never about a tiny ghost in your skull, making choices independent of your brain. Maybe it was always your brain, all of it, conscious and unconscious together, working as one continuous process that simply reports its conclusions to you slightly after the fact. A psychologist named Roy Baumeister studied something related to this and found a practical twist. People who were led to believe free will doesn't exist became measurably less honest, less helpful, more likely to cheat in lab experiments. The belief itself changed behavior regardless of whether free will was real in some deeper philosophical sense. In other words, believing you're in control might matter almost as much as actually being in control. So think about your last big decision, the job you took, the apology you gave or didn't give, the relationship you stayed in or walked away from. You felt like you weighed it carefully, like you were the author. But underneath that feeling, your brain had likely already been building toward that decision for seconds, minutes, maybe years, shaped by every experience that came before it. The moment you felt yourself deciding may have simply been the moment your mind finished its paperwork and sent you the memo. Does that make the decision less yours? Or does it just mean you were always bigger and slower to notice yourself than you ever realized? Tonight, when you choose what to watch, what to eat, who to text back, notice the feeling of choosing. Notice how confident it feels, how instant it seems. Then remember Libet's clock, remember Haynes' scanner, quietly reading your decision before you ever felt it arrive. You think you just decided to keep reading this sentence, but the truth is, some part of you decided that a long time before you ever felt yourself agree.
वीडियोस बनाने हैं, फिल्मोरा है ना।